Sarah Matthews thought it was just another ordinary Tuesday evening when she stepped off the city bus at 42nd Street. The rain had just stopped, leaving the pavement slick and reflecting the neon lights of the downtown district. She clutched her purse tighter, thinking about the late shift at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. What she didn't know was that in less than 10 minutes her life would intersect with a story that would shock the nation and remind everyone why you should never underestimate the bonds forged in the crucible of military brotherhood. This isn't just another tale of random violence in the city. This is the story of what happens when ordinary evil meets extraordinary loyalty. When three men made the worst mistake of their lives by targeting the wrong woman on the wrong night in the wrong neighborhood, they thought they had found an easy victim walking alone. They had no idea they were about to discover why the motto, "Leave no one behind," isn't just words painted on a wall. What you're about to read really happened. The names have been changed, the locations altered slightly, but the events are real. This is the story of Sarah Matthews, the nurse who survived. Marcus Tank Rodriguez, the Navy SEAL who refused to let injustice slide. And three men who learned too late that some people have friends you definitely don't want to meet in a dark alley. Sometimes the most powerful stories aren't found in movies or books. Sometimes they're happening right now, in your city, to people who look just like the ones you pass on the street every day. This is one of those stories. Sarah Matthews had been working double shifts at St. Cab, Mary's Hospital, for 3 weeks straight. The nursing shortage meant everyone was pulling extra hours, and Sarah never said no when they needed help. At 28, she had the energy for it, and more importantly, she needed the money. Her younger brother Danny was starting his second year of college, and their parents had already stretched their savings to the limit. The evening rain had finally stopped as Sarah walked down 42nd Street toward the bus stop. She checked her phone for the time, 11:47 p.m. The late bus would get her home by midnight, giving her just enough time to grab a quick shower and maybe watch something mindless on Netflix before falling asleep. She had another 12-hour shift starting at 7 in the morning. The street was quieter than usual for a Tuesday night. Most of the shops had closed hours ago, their security gates pulled down and locked. The only places still open were a 24-hour convenience store about 2 blocks away and Murphy's Bar, which stayed open until 2 a.m. on weeknights. Sarah could hear faint music drifting from Murphy's, mixed with the occasional laugh or raised voice. She pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders. The rain had left the air chilly, and she was already thinking about the hot cup of tea she'd make when she got home. Sarah had been walking this same route for almost 2 years, ever since she'd started working at St. Mary's. It was safe, well lit, and the bus stop was right across from a police station. She'd never had any problems. That's why she didn't pay much attention when she heard footsteps behind her. People walked this street all the time, especially coming from Murphy's. But as she continued walking, she noticed the footsteps seemed to be matching her pace. When she slowed down slightly, they slowed down too. When she sped up, they did the same. Sarah's training as a nurse had taught her to trust her instincts. Something felt wrong. She pulled out her phone and pretended to check her messages while actually using the screen's reflection to look behind her. 3 men were following her, staying about 20 feet back. They were young, probably in their early 20s, and they kept looking around as if making sure no one else was watching. Her heart started beating faster. The bus stop was still 3 blocks away, and the police station was on the other side of the street. She thought about crossing over, but that would mean walking directly toward the men to get to the crosswalk. Instead, she decided to duck into the convenience store she could see ahead. There would be other people there, bright lights and security cameras. But, as she approached the store, she saw that it was closed. A handwritten sign on the door read, "Sorry, closed early due to family emergency." The lights were off, and the parking lot was empty except for a few pieces of scattered trash blowing in the wind. The footsteps behind her were getting closer now. Sarah could hear them talking in low voices, but she couldn't make out what they were saying. She quickened her pace, but the bus stop still seemed impossibly far away. The next block had several small businesses, but they were all closed. Dark windows stared back at her like empty eyes. "Hey, lady," one of the men called out. "Wait up." Sarah's nursing instincts kicked in completely now. She'd seen enough violence in the emergency room to know that when strangers on a dark street tell you to wait up, you run. She broke into a sprint, her white sneakers slapping against the wet pavement. But the men were faster. She heard them running behind her, their heavy boots pounding on the street. Sarah had always been athletic, but she was tired from working double shifts, and her purse was bouncing against her side, throwing off her balance. She made it about half a block before they caught up with her. The first man, a thin guy with a patchy beard and a baseball cap, grabbed her shoulder and spun her around. The second man, stockier with tattoos covering his forearms, moved to block her path back toward Murphy's bar. The third man, the tallest of the group with bleached blonde hair, positioned himself to cut off her escape toward the bus stop. "Where you going so fast?" the thin man asked, still gripping her shoulder. His breath smelled like cheap beer and cigarettes. "We just want to talk." "Please," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I don't want any trouble. I'm just trying to get home." "Nobody said anything about trouble," the stocky man said, stepping closer. "We just need to borrow a little money. You look like someone who's got money." Sarah was wearing her hospital scrubs under her jacket, and her white sneakers were scuffed from long shifts on her feet. If she looked like someone with money, these men weren't very good judges of character. But she realized that logic wasn't going to help her here. "I don't have much," she said honestly. "Maybe $20 in cash." $20? The blonde man laughed, but it wasn't a friendly sound. "Lady, do we look stupid to you? You're coming from the fancy part of town, walking around with that nice purse, that nice phone. $20 is an insult." Sarah wanted to explain that she'd been coming from the hospital, that she was a nurse who worked extra shifts just to help pay for her brother's college, that the purse was a Christmas gift from 2 years ago, and the phone was the cheapest plan she could find. But she could see in their eyes that explanations wouldn't matter. "Look," she tried again, "I can give you what I have, and I can use my card to get more money from the ATM at the gas station. You don't need to hurt anyone. I'll cooperate." The thin man seemed to consider this, but the stocky one shook his head. "Nah, man. She's seen our faces. She's going to call the cops the minute we let her go." "I won't," Sarah said quickly. "I promise. I just want to go home. I won't say anything to anyone." "Sure you won't," the blonde man said sarcastically. He moved closer, and Sarah could see a small scar above his left eyebrow. "That's what they all say." It was at that moment that Sarah realized money wasn't all they wanted. The way they were looking at her, the way they had positioned themselves to cut off all her escape routes, the casual way they talked about her calling the police as if it was a foregone conclusion that she'd have something to report. This wasn't just a robbery. Fear turned to terror in her chest. She thought about her brother Danny, probably studying late in his dorm room right now. She thought about her parents, who would be devastated. She thought about all the patients she'd helped, all the lives she'd touched, all the things she still wanted to do. "Please," she whispered, "please don't hurt me." The stocky man reached into his jacket and pulled out something that glinted in the streetlight. A knife. Not a big one, but big enough. Sarah's medical training immediately catalogued all the ways a blade that size could cause damage, all the vital organs it could reach, all the arteries it could sever. "Nobody's going to hurt you if you do what we say," the thin man said, but his grip on her shoulder had tightened, and his voice had changed. It was harder now, more dangerous. "But you need to understand that we're serious here." That's when Sarah made the decision that probably saved her life. Instead of freezing, instead of complying, instead of hoping they would take what they wanted and leave her alone, she screamed. Not a little shriek or a call for help, but a full-throated, nurse-trained scream that could be heard 3 blocks away. "Help! Help me! Somebody help!" The thin man's hand clamped over her mouth, but it was too late. Her voice had already echoed off the buildings around them. Dogs started barking in the distance. A car alarm went off somewhere, triggered by the sound. "Shut her up!" the blonde man hissed, looking around frantically. The stocky man raised the knife and Sarah saw her death in his eyes. But then something unexpected happened. The thin man, the one whose hand was covering her mouth, suddenly looked uncertain. "Wait," he said. "Did you guys hear that? They all froze, listening." Sarah heard it too. The sound of a door slamming, followed by heavy footsteps running toward them. Someone had heard her scream, and someone was coming. "Time to go," the blonde man said, backing away. But the stocky man wasn't ready to leave. Maybe it was pride, or anger at being interrupted, or just the adrenaline of the moment. Instead of running, he pulled his hand back and drove his fist hard into Sarah's stomach. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Sarah doubled over, gasping for air, and fell to her knees on the wet pavement. The men started to run, their footsteps disappearing into the night. But Sarah barely noticed. She was focused on breathing, on staying conscious, on the sharp pain radiating through her abdomen. But even through the pain, she heard the footsteps getting closer. Someone was still coming. Someone had heard her scream, and they hadn't stopped running just because the attackers had fled. "Ma'am! Ma'am, are you okay?" The voice was deep, calm, and authoritative. Sarah looked up and saw a man kneeling beside her. He was big, probably 6 feet tall, and built like someone who spent serious time in the gym. He had dark hair cut very short, and his eyes were scanning the area around them, even as he checked to make sure she was okay. "Did they hurt you? Are you injured?" he asked, his hands hovering near her but not touching, clearly trained in how to help someone without making them feel more threatened. "My stomach," Sarah managed to gasp. "He hit me in the stomach." The man's expression darkened. "How many of them were there?" "Which way did they go?" "3," Sarah said, still struggling to catch her breath. "They went that way." She pointed down the street toward the old warehouse district. The man pulled out his phone and dialed 911 with practiced efficiency. While he waited for the operator to answer, he looked at Sarah with genuine concern. "I'm Marcus," he said. "I was at Murphy's bar when I heard you scream. The paramedics are going to be here in a few minutes, and the police are on their way too." "Sarah," she managed to say.
"My name is Sarah. Okay, Sarah."
"You're going to be fine. You did exactly the right thing by screaming. That probably saved your life." As they waited for help to arrive, Marcus stayed with her, talking in a calm, reassuring voice about nothing important, just keeping her focused and alert. But Sarah noticed that his eyes never stopped moving, constantly scanning the area around them. He positioned himself between her and the direction the men had gone, and kept one hand near his waistband, in a way that suggested he might have a weapon. When the paramedics arrived, followed closely by 2 police officers, Marcus gave his statement efficiently and professionally. He described the 3 men in detail, including their approximate heights, weights, and the direction they'd fled. He mentioned the knife, the way they had positioned themselves to cut off Sarah's escape routes, and the deliberate punch to her stomach. "You military?" one of the police officers asked him. "Navy," Marcus replied simply. The officer nodded as if that explained everything about Marcus's calm competence and attention to detail. Sarah was loaded into the ambulance for a trip to the hospital. Ironically, it was the same hospital where she worked, and she recognized the paramedic who was checking her vitals. As they pulled away from the scene, she looked back and saw Marcus talking intently with the police officers, his hands moving as he pointed in different directions and described what he had seen. At the hospital, the doctors determined that while the punch had left her badly bruised and shaken, there was no serious internal damage. She was lucky, they said. A few inches higher or lower, and the blow could have caused real problems. But as Sarah lay in the emergency room bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about what had almost happened to her, she realized that luck hadn't been the only thing that saved her that night. Someone had heard her scream. Someone had come running toward danger instead of away from it. Someone had stayed with her and made sure she was safe. She asked the nurse to get Marcus's contact information from the police report. She wanted to thank him properly, to let him know how grateful she was. But when the nurse came back, she had a strange expression on her face. "The police officers said he didn't leave any contact information," the nurse reported. "He just said to tell you that he was glad you were okay and that he hoped they caught the guys who did this." Sarah felt a mixture of disappointment and curiosity. Who was this Marcus who had appeared out of nowhere to help her, then disappeared just as quickly? And why did she have the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story, but just the beginning? Detective Ray Coleman had been working nights in the downtown district for 8 years, and he thought he'd seen everything. But there was something about the Sarah Matthews case that bothered him. Maybe it was the systematic way the attackers had positioned themselves, or the fact that they'd been bold enough to assault someone so close to the police station. Or maybe it was the military guy who'd helped her, then vanished without leaving so much as a phone number. The next morning, Coleman sat at his desk, reviewing the case file while sipping his 3rd cup of coffee. The surveillance cameras from nearby businesses had caught glimpses of the incident, but the quality was poor, and the men had kept their faces turned away from the lenses. Either they were very lucky, or they knew exactly where the cameras were located.
"Another robbery gone wrong?" his partner, Detective Lisa Park, asked as she looked over his shoulder at the photos.
"Maybe," Coleman said, but his tone suggested he didn't think so. "Look at this, though." The witness who helped her gave descriptions that were incredibly detailed. Height, weight, distinguishing marks, even estimated shoe sizes based on their footprints. Park raised an eyebrow. "Estimated shoe sizes? Military training," Coleman explained. "The guy's name was Marcus something, but he didn't stick around long enough for us to get a full statement. Just gave the basics and disappeared." "You think he's involved?" Coleman shook his head. "No, his story checks out. The bartender at Murphy's confirmed he was there all evening, paid his tab, and then ran out when he heard the woman screaming. but there's something about the way he described the attackers. It's like he was taking notes for a mission briefing. While the detectives were discussing the case, Marcus Rodriguez was 3 miles away in a small apartment above a martial arts studio. He'd been staring at the ceiling since 5 in the morning, unable to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sarah's face when that man hit her. The fear, the pain, the vulnerability. It reminded him too much of other faces from other places, faces he'd been trying to forget for months. Marcus had left the Navy 6 months earlier after 12 years of service, including 4 tours as a SEAL. He'd seen combat in Afghanistan and Iraq, had been part of operations that never made the news, and had lost too many good friends to count. The official reason for his discharge was a knee injury from an IED explosion. The real reason was that he'd started seeing those faces everywhere he went. The therapist at the VA hospital called it PTSD and survivor's guilt. Marcus called it being tired of watching good people get hurt while bad people walked away. Either way, he'd decided it was time to come home to Chicago and figure out what the rest of his life was going to look like. He'd been doing okay, mostly. He had a part-time job doing security consulting for small businesses, and he taught self-defense classes at the martial arts studio downstairs. He kept to himself, avoided crowds, and tried not to think too much about the past. But last night had changed something. Seeing Sarah in danger, hearing her scream, watching her crumple to the ground after being hit, it had awakened something in him that he'd been trying to keep buried. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. "Hello? Is this Marcus Rodriguez?" The voice was professional, authoritative. "Who's asking?" "Detective Coleman, Chicago PD. I was hoping we could talk about what happened last night." "The woman you helped, Sarah Matthews. She's been asking about you."
Marcus felt a surprising flutter of something in his chest.
Relief? Concern. Is she okay? "She's fine. Bruised and shaken up, but no serious injuries. Look, I know you already gave a statement last night, but I was wondering if you might have noticed anything else. Sometimes details come back to you after the adrenaline wears off." Marcus could hear something in the detective's voice, a hint that this was about more than just collecting additional details. "What aren't you telling me?" There was a pause before Coleman answered. "Can we meet somewhere? I'd rather discuss this in person." They agreed to meet at a diner near the police station. Marcus arrived first and chose a booth in the back with a clear view of both the entrance and the exit. Old habits. When Detective Coleman walked in, Marcus recognized the type immediately. Career cop, probably military background himself. Someone who'd seen enough to know when something didn't feel right. Coleman slid into the booth across from him and studied Marcus for a moment before speaking. "You want to tell me why a former Navy SEAL is living in a crappy apartment above a martial arts studio and doing security consulting for neighborhood businesses?" Marcus wasn't surprised that the detective had done his homework. "You want to tell me why a Chicago PD detective is interested in a routine mugging case?" Coleman smiled grimly. "Touché. Okay, here's the thing. This wasn't routine. Those 3 guys didn't just randomly pick Sarah Matthews as a target. They were waiting for her." "What makes you say that?" Coleman pulled out his phone and showed Marcus a series of still frames from security cameras. "We pulled footage from every business on that street going back a week. These same 3 men have been walking that route every Tuesday night for the past month. Always at the same time, always following the same pattern." Marcus studied the images. The quality was poor, but he could make out the general shapes and sizes of the men. They were stalking her. That's what it looks like. Sarah Matthews works double shifts every Tuesday at St. Mary's Hospital. She takes the same bus, walks the same route home. Someone's been watching her schedule. Any idea who? Coleman shook his head. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. Sarah can't think of anyone who would want to hurt her. She's a nurse, for Christ's sake. Spends her time helping people. Never been married, no ex-boyfriends with grudges, no gambling debts, no drug connections. She's about as clean as they come." Marcus felt that familiar anger building in his chest, the same feeling that had driven him through 12 years of military service. Good people being threatened by those who preyed on the innocent. "So what do you need from me?" "Honestly, I'm not sure yet. But you saw these guys up close, and you've got training that might help us figure out what we're dealing with. Plus, Sarah's been asking about you. I think she'd feel safer knowing you were involved. Sarah wants to see me. She wants to thank you. But more than that, I think she's scared. She knows this wasn't random, even if she can't explain why. Women develop instincts about these things, especially women who work in hospitals and see what people are capable of doing to each other." Marcus thought about it for a long moment. He'd come home to Chicago to get away from violence, to find some kind of peace. But maybe peace wasn't about avoiding conflict. Maybe it was about choosing which conflicts were worth fighting. What do you want me to do? Coleman leaned forward. Help me catch these guys before they try again, because I guarantee you, they're going to try again. Men who stalk their victims for a month don't just give up because their first attempt got interrupted. That afternoon, Marcus found himself walking through the halls of St. Corker, Mary's hospital, following directions to Sarah's room. She'd been kept overnight for observation, more as a precaution than because of any serious injuries. But as he approached her door, he could hear voices inside, and one of them sounded upset. He knocked softly and waited for permission to enter. Sarah was sitting up in bed, and a man who looked like an older version of her was standing beside the bed with his arms crossed. Her father, Marcus guessed. Sarah? I'm Marcus, from last night. Her face lit up with genuine relief and gratitude. Marcus, I can't believe you're here. I was hoping I'd get a chance to thank you properly. Her father, however, looked him up and down with obvious suspicion. So you're the guy who was hanging around the scene last night. Dad, he saved my life. Sarah said firmly. I'm just saying, it's awfully convenient that he happened to be in the right place at the right time. Marcus understood the father's protective instincts, but he also saw how the suspicion was affecting Sarah. She was embarrassed and apologetic, torn between gratitude and family loyalty. Mr. Matthews, Marcus said calmly, I know you're concerned about your daughter's safety. That's exactly what a good father should be. If you want to run a background check on me or have the police verify my story, I completely understand.
The direct approach seemed to catch Sarah's father off guard.
He studied Marcus more carefully, taking in the military bearing, the respectful tone, the way Marcus positioned himself near the door rather than crowding into Sarah's personal space.
You're military, he said.
It wasn't a question. Navy. Just got out 6 months ago. What kind of Navy? Marcus met his eyes steadily. The kind that doesn't leave people behind. Something in his tone seemed to satisfy Sarah's father. The tension in his shoulders relaxed slightly, and he uncrossed his arms. Well, he said finally, I guess I owe you a thank you then. No, you don't. But I would like to talk to Sarah about what happened, if that's okay. Detective Coleman thinks there might be more to this than a random mugging. Sarah's eyes widened. What do you mean? Marcus looked at her father, who nodded for him to continue. The police have evidence that these men have been watching you for weeks, following your routine, learning your schedule. This wasn't random, Sarah. Someone specifically targeted you. The color drained from Sarah's face. But why? I don't understand. I'm nobody special. I'm just a nurse. That's what we need to figure out, Marcus said gently. But until we do, you need to be very careful. Change your routine, don't go anywhere alone, and trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. What about the police? Aren't they going to protect her? Her father asked. They'll do what they can, but they've got limited resources and a lot of cases. These guys are going to lay low for a while, but they'll be back. Men who plan this carefully don't just give up. Sarah looked scared, but also determined. So what do I do? Hide for the rest of my life? No, Marcus said. We catch them before they have a chance to try again. Over the next hour, Marcus and Detective Coleman worked with Sarah to reconstruct everything she could remember about her recent weeks. Had she noticed anyone following her? Any strange phone calls or messages? Anyone asking unusual questions about her schedule? It was Sarah's father who made the connection that broke the case open. Wait, he said suddenly. Sarah, didn't you tell me about that new patient a few weeks ago, the one who kept asking personal questions? Sarah frowned, trying to remember. You mean Jake Morrison? He was in for a heroin overdose, stayed for 3 days. But he wasn't unusual, Dad. A lot of addicts are paranoid and ask weird questions. What kind of questions? Marcus asked. Just personal stuff. When I worked, how I got home, if I lived alone. I figured he was just trying to make conversation. He seemed lonely. Coleman was already pulling out his phone to run the name Jake Morrison through the system. Within minutes he had a match. Jake Morrison, 22 years old. Multiple arrests for drug possession and petty theft. But here's the interesting part. His known associates include Danny Walsh and Brett Miller. Both have records for assault and robbery. Marcus felt the pieces clicking together. 3 names, 3 men. Morrison was gathering intelligence while he was in the hospital, then passed the information to his friends. But it still doesn't explain why they targeted me specifically, Sarah said. There are dozens of nurses at the hospital. Why me? Coleman was scrolling through more information on his phone. Maybe because you were kind to him. Morrison's file shows a history of mental illness along with the drug problems. Sometimes people like that develop obsessions with anyone who shows them kindness. Or maybe, Marcus said grimly, you were just convenient. Young, single, predictable schedule, and you walk home alone through a quiet area. To someone looking for an easy target, you probably seemed perfect. The thought that her compassion as a nurse had made her a target was devastating to Sarah. Marcus could see it in her eyes, the way she was starting to blame herself for being kind to a patient who'd betrayed that kindness. Hey, he said firmly, this is not your fault. You did your job, and you did it well. The fact that some people abuse kindness doesn't mean you should stop being kind. It just means we need to make sure they face consequences for their choices. Sarah's father was looking back and forth between Marcus and Detective Coleman. So what's the plan? How do we catch these guys? Coleman closed his phone and looked at Marcus. We're going to need bait. Absolutely not, Sarah said immediately. I'm not going to be bait for anything. You wouldn't be in any real danger, Coleman explained. We'd have surveillance teams positioned everywhere, and Marcus would be close enough to intervene if anything went wrong. Like he was last night? Sarah's father asked pointedly. Last night I was lucky to be in the right place at the right time, Marcus said. This time we'd be prepared. They'd never get close enough to hurt you. But Sarah was shaking her head. I can't. I'm sorry, but I just can't. The thought of facing those men again, of deliberately putting myself in danger, I can't do it. Marcus understood completely. She'd been through enough trauma for one lifetime, and asking her to voluntarily face her attackers again was probably too much. But he also knew that Coleman was right about one thing. These men would try again. If not Sarah, then someone else. And the next victim might not be lucky enough to have anyone hear her scream. What if, he said slowly, we found another way? What if we could draw them out without putting you at risk? Marcus spent the next 3 days doing what he did best, gathering intelligence and planning an operation. But instead of targeting enemy combatants in Afghanistan, he was hunting 3 criminals in downtown Chicago. The methodology was the same, even if the location was different. He started by mapping the area where Sarah had been attacked, noting every camera, every alley, every potential escape route. Then he expanded outward, studying the neighborhood where Jake Morrison was known to hang out, identifying the places where Danny Walsh and Brett Miller were likely to be found. Detective Coleman had provided him with everything the police had on the 3 men. Morrison was the weak link, a drug addict with psychological problems, who was more likely to make mistakes. Walsh was the muscle, with multiple assault charges and a reputation for violence. Miller was the planner, smart enough to have avoided conviction on several previous charges despite being arrested multiple times. What bothered Marcus most was how well they'd planned Sarah's attack. The timing, the location, the way they'd positioned themselves to cut off her escape routes. It showed a level of sophistication that didn't match their criminal records. Either they'd been coached by someone with more experience, or they were learning fast. On Thursday morning, Marcus got the break he was looking for. His contacts in the veteran community had put him in touch with a former Army Ranger named Tommy Valdez, who now worked as a bartender in the neighborhood where the 3 suspects were known to operate. Tommy had agreed to keep his ears open and let Marcus know if he heard anything useful.
Your boys were in here last night, Tommy reported over the phone.
Morrison was tweaking pretty hard. Kept talking about how they needed to finish what they started. The other 2 were trying to shut him up, but he wasn't listening. Did they say anything specific about their plans? Morrison kept saying the nurse girl could identify them, that they needed to take care of the problem. The big guy, Walsh, seemed more interested in finding the guy who interrupted them. He was asking around about military types in the area, anyone new who might match the description. Marcus felt a cold satisfaction. They were looking for him, which meant they felt threatened. Threatened people made mistakes. Anything else? Yeah. Miller, the blonde one, he mentioned something about Tuesday night being perfect because that's when she walks home alone. But then Morrison said maybe they should switch it up, try a different night when she wouldn't be expecting them. That was concerning. If they changed their pattern, it would be much harder to anticipate and prevent their next move. Marcus thanked Tommy and hung up, then called Detective Coleman to share the information. We need to move faster, Coleman said after hearing the report. If they're planning to change their approach, we could lose our window to catch them. Agreed. but I have an idea that might draw them out sooner rather than later. Marcus's plan was simple but risky. He would make himself visible in the neighborhood, let word get back to the three men that he was looking for them. The natural response would be for them to either flee the area or try to eliminate him as a threat. Given their apparent willingness to use violence and the fact that fleeing would mean abandoning their obsession with Sarah, Marcus was betting they'd choose confrontation. That evening, he started making the rounds of bars and social clubs in the area where the suspects were known to hang out. He didn't try to hide who he was or what he was doing. When people asked, he told them he was looking for the three men who'd attacked a friend of his. Word would get back to them within hours. Meanwhile, Detective Coleman had arranged for increased patrols around Sarah's apartment and the hospital where she worked. They couldn't provide round-the-clock protection, but they could at least make sure she wasn't caught off guard again. Sarah herself was struggling with a mixture of fear and frustration. She'd taken leave from work on her doctor's recommendation, but sitting around her apartment thinking about what had happened was driving her crazy. Her brother Danny had come home from college to stay with her, and her parents were calling every few hours to check on her. "I hate this," she told Danny on Thursday evening as they ate takeout Chinese food in her living room. "I hate feeling scared in my own home. I hate that some jerk I tried to help is now threatening my life. I hate that I can't do my job because I'm afraid to leave the apartment." Danny looked up from his lo mein noodles. He was 20 years old, with the same brown eyes as his sister but a softer, less determined expression. "Maybe you should consider moving back home with Mum and Dad for a while, at least until the police catch these guys. I'm not going to let them chase me out of my life, Danny. This is my home, my job, my life. I worked too hard to build it, to just walk away because some criminals decided to target me. But if they're planning to come after you again, then we stop them. Marcus and Detective Coleman have a plan to catch them. I trust them." Danny frowned. "Sarah, you don't even know this Marcus guy. He showed up out of nowhere to help you, which was great, but that doesn't mean you should trust him with your life." Sarah had been thinking about this a lot over the past few days. Why did she trust Marcus? She'd only met him twice, and each time had been under stressful circumstances. But there was something about him. The way he'd stayed calm when she was panicking. The way he'd positioned himself to protect her without making her feel crowded or threatened. And there was something in his eyes, a kind of sadness that suggested he understood what it was like to be hurt by the world. "I can't explain it," she said finally, "but I think he's someone who spent his life protecting people, and I think he needs to protect people as much as they need to be protected." That night, Marcus got the response he'd been hoping for. Tommy called him just after midnight. "They took the bait," Tommy reported. "All three of them were here about an hour ago, asking questions about you. They wanted to know where you lived, where you worked, what kind of car you drove." Morrison was practically vibrating with rage. "What did you tell them?" "What you wanted me to tell them. That you'd been asking around about them, that you seemed to know what you were doing, and that word was, you'd be back tomorrow night around 11. "Perfect. Were they buying it?" "Oh yeah." Walsh was talking about teaching military boy a lesson. Miller was more cautious. Kept asking if anyone knew what kind of training you had, but Morrison was pushing for immediate action. "My guess is they'll be waiting for you tomorrow night." Marcus smiled grimly. "Good. Where?" "There's an abandoned parking lot behind the old textile warehouse on Industrial Avenue. Miller suggested it because it's isolated, no cameras, easy to dispose of a body if necessary." The casual way Tommy relayed that last part reminded Marcus that this wasn't a game. These men were planning to kill him. If he made any mistakes, if his timing was off, if backup didn't arrive when it was supposed to, he would die in that parking lot. But he'd faced those odds before, in places where the stakes were higher and the enemy was better trained. Three small-time criminals with a plan they'd made in a bar, after too many drinks, were hardly the most dangerous opponents he'd ever faced. The next morning, Marcus met with Detective Coleman and two other officers to go over the operation. The plan was for Marcus to show up at the designated location as promised, but with backup positioned around the perimeter. When the three men made their move, the police would close in and arrest them. "You sure you want to do this?" Coleman asked. "We could try a different approach. Maybe set up surveillance and wait for them to make a move on Sarah." "No," Marcus said firmly. "This ends tomorrow night. Sarah's been through enough, and these guys aren't going to stop until someone stops them. This is the best way to control the situation. And if something goes wrong, if they're better prepared than we think," Marcus met his eyes steadily. "Detective, I've been shot at by Taliban fighters and Afghan drug lords. I've been in firefights with people who've been killing since they were children. These three guys are dangerous, but they're not soldiers. I'll be fine." That afternoon, Marcus did something he hadn't done in months. He went to visit his teammate's grave. Staff Sergeant Mike Chen had been killed by an IED in Afghanistan 2 years earlier, during Marcus's final deployment. They'd been close friends, and Mike's death had been one of the factors that convinced Marcus to leave the service. Standing beside the grave marker, Marcus found himself talking to his dead friend the way he used to when they were on patrol together. I know you'd probably think I'm being stupid getting involved in civilian problems when I came home to get away from all that, but there's this woman, Mike. She's a nurse, spends her life helping people, and some lowlifes decided to target her because she was kind to one of them. She doesn't deserve that. Nobody deserves that. The wind rustled through the trees around the cemetery, and Marcus could almost hear Mike's voice telling him he was overthinking things. Mike had always been the practical one, the guy who cut through all the philosophical debates and focused on what needed to be done. You're right, Marcus said aloud. Bad guys are threatening a good person. We stop the bad guys. Simple as that. That evening, Sarah was pacing around her apartment, unable to concentrate on anything. She knew Marcus was planning to confront her attackers tonight, and the knowledge was making her sick with worry. She tried calling him to talk him out of it, but his phone went straight to voicemail. He's going to get himself killed, she told Danny, who was trying to distract her with a movie. Sarah, you said yourself that he's trained for this kind of thing. He's a Navy SEAL, right? This is probably just another day at the office for him. That's exactly the problem. He's treating this like a military operation. But these aren't enemy soldiers. They're criminals with nothing to lose. They don't follow rules of engagement or worry about collateral damage. Danny paused the movie and turned to look at his sister. Why do you care so much about what happens to him? I mean, I'm grateful that he helped you, but you barely know the guy. Sarah stopped pacing and sat down on the couch. I don't know. Maybe because he's the first person I've met in a long time who is willing to run toward danger to help a stranger. Or maybe because I can see that he's carrying around his own pain, his own ghosts, and I recognize that. As a nurse, you learn to see when people are hurting, even when they're trying to hide it. You think he's doing this for you or for himself? Both, maybe. I think he needs to believe that he can still protect people, that his skills and training can be used for something good, and I think he sees me as someone worth protecting. At 10:30 that night, Marcus parked his truck 6 blocks away from the abandoned parking lot behind the textile warehouse. He'd been carrying concealed weapons legally since his discharge from the Navy, and tonight he had his service pistol and a backup weapon secured in an ankle holster. He also wore a lightweight vest under his jacket, not bulletproof but able to stop a knife or reduce the impact of a blunt weapon. The parking lot was exactly as Tommy had described it, isolated, dark, and surrounded by abandoned buildings. Perfect for an ambush, which was undoubtedly what the 3 men had in mind. But Marcus had fought in Afghanistan and Iraq, places where every street corner could hide an enemy, and every building might contain a sniper. An abandoned parking lot in Chicago was practically a vacation spot by comparison. He walked openly across the lot, making no attempt at stealth. The plan required him to be visible, to draw the 3 men into the open where the police could see them clearly. His job was to stay alive long enough for backup to arrive and make the arrests. They kept him waiting exactly 8 minutes. Marcus used the time to position himself near a concrete loading dock that would provide cover if things went wrong, and to spot the locations where Coleman and his officers were hidden around the perimeter. Then he heard the sound of multiple car doors slamming, followed by footsteps on gravel. 3 men emerged from behind a pile of construction debris, walking in a loose formation that put him in the center of a triangle. Morrison was on the left, twitchy and obviously high on something. Walsh was on the right, bigger and more confident, with something bulky in his jacket pocket. Miller was directly in front of him, the leader, the one making the tactical decisions. So you're the hero who interrupted our business the other night, Miller called out when they were about 20 feet away. I'm the guy who's going to make sure you spend the next 10 years in prison, Marcus replied calmly. Miller laughed, but there was no humor in it. I don't think so, military boy. I think you're going to have an accident in this parking lot, and then we're going to finish what we started with your nurse girlfriend.
That was all Marcus needed to hear.
The threat against Sarah was clear and unambiguous, which meant the police had grounds to move in immediately. But before he could signal for backup, Morrison pulled out a gun. It was a small pistol, probably a .22. But even a small bullet could kill if it hit the right place. Marcus dove toward the concrete loading dock as Morrison fired 3 quick shots, the sound echoing off the surrounding buildings. Walsh was charging toward him with what looked like a lead pipe, while Miller circled around to cut off his retreat. The police backup was supposed to move in within seconds, but Marcus realized that seconds could be a very long time when people were shooting at you. He drew his own weapon and put 2 rounds center mass into Walsh, who dropped the pipe and fell backward onto the gravel. Morrison was still firing wildly, his shots going everywhere except where they were aimed. Miller had produced a knife and was closing the distance between them. Marcus put a single shot into Morrison's shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. That left Miller, who was smart enough to realize that bringing a knife to a gunfight was generally a losing proposition. "Drop the weapon!" Detective Coleman's voice cut through the night air as police officers emerged from their positions around the lot. "Chicago PD! Drop your weapons now." Miller looked around, saw the badges and drawn weapons, and let the knife fall from his hands. Morrison was writhing on the ground, clutching his shoulder and screaming. Walsh wasn't moving at all. Marcus kept his weapon trained on Miller until the officers could secure him, then knelt beside Walsh to check for a pulse. He was alive but unconscious, with 2 entry wounds in his chest. Marcus immediately began applying pressure to the wounds, his military first aid training kicking in automatically. "Ambulance is on the way," Coleman said, appearing beside him. "How bad is he?" "He'll live if the paramedics get here in the next few minutes. The rounds missed his heart and major arteries. What about you? Are you hit?" Marcus did a quick inventory of himself. "No, I'm fine. Morrison's a terrible shot." 10 minutes later, Walsh and Morrison were being loaded into separate ambulances, while Miller was cuffed in the back of a police car. The parking lot was full of officers, paramedics, and crime scene technicians. Marcus sat on the concrete loading dock, giving his statement to Detective Coleman. "Textbook operation," Coleman said when they finished. "Clean, controlled, minimal casualties. Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" 12 years of practice. But I was hoping it wouldn't come to that. They made the choice when Morrison pulled a gun. You did what you had to do." Marcus nodded, but he felt the familiar weight of having hurt someone, even someone who'd been trying to hurt him. It never got easier, no matter how justified it was. His phone rang, and he saw Sarah's number on the display. "Marcus? Oh my God, I heard sirens. Are you okay? Did they catch them?" "I'm fine, Sarah. We got all 3 of them. It's over." He could hear her crying on the other end of the line, relief and exhaustion finally breaking through the fear she'd been carrying for days. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for keeping me safe. Thank you for giving me a reason to fight again," he said quietly. But as Marcus looked around the parking lot at the ambulances and police cars, he wondered if it really was over, or if this was just the beginning of something else entirely. The legal proceedings moved faster than anyone expected, with clear evidence of premeditation, assault, and attempted murder. All 3 men accepted plea bargains rather than risk going to trial. Morrison got 8 years for assault and weapons charges, with mandatory drug treatment. Walsh received 12 years for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. Miller, as the ringleader who had planned the stalking and coordinated the attacks, was sentenced to 15 years. Sarah attended each of the hearings, wanting to look her attackers in the eye as they received their sentences. Marcus went with her, sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom but providing a steadying presence. During Morrison's sentencing, the young man turned to look at Sarah with what might have been remorse. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. "I never meant for it to go that far. The drugs, they make you think crazy things." Sarah nodded but didn't respond. She'd learned in her years as a nurse that apologies from people who had hurt others were often more about the apologizer's guilt than the victim's healing. Still, she was glad he'd said it. It confirmed what she'd already decided. She wouldn't let this experience make her cynical about helping people who were struggling with addiction. After the final hearing, Sarah and Marcus walked out of the courthouse together into a bright October morning. The case was officially closed, justice had been served, and life could theoretically return to normal. But both of them had changed in ways that made normal feel like a foreign concept. "So what now?" Sarah asked as they stood on the courthouse steps. Marcus looked around at the bustling city street, the people hurrying past with their own problems and destinations. A month ago, he'd been drifting through life, going through the motions of civilian existence without any real purpose. Now he felt something he hadn't experienced since leaving the Navy. The sense that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I guess we figure it out as we go." Sarah had been thinking about the same question for weeks. Her leave of absence from the hospital was ending, and she needed to decide whether to return to her old job and her old routine, or to make some changes. The attack had shaken her confidence, but it had also clarified what was really important to her. "I've been offered a position in the emergency trauma unit," she told him. "More responsibility, better pay, but also more stress and longer hours. What does your gut tell you?"
"That I'm tired of playing it safe."
"That maybe getting hurt doesn't mean you have to live small." They walked to a nearby coffee shop and found a table by the window. The conversation that followed was the kind that people have when they're trying to figure out if they've just shared an intense experience or if they found something more lasting. Marcus told her about his struggles adjusting to civilian life, about the nightmares and the guilt, and the feeling that all his skills and training were useless in a world that didn't need warriors. Sarah told him about her fears that she'd become too cautious, too focused on avoiding risk, instead of embracing the things that made life worth living. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said after they'd been talking for an hour. "Sure." "When you ran toward the sound of me screaming that night, were you thinking about me, or were you thinking about someone else?" The question caught Marcus off guard. He'd been expecting her to ask about the shooting, or about his military service, or about what he planned to do next, but she'd gone straight to the heart of something he'd been avoiding even in his own thoughts. "Both, maybe," he said finally. "There have been times when I couldn't help people who needed it, times when I got there too late, or when the situation was too dangerous, or when the politics of the situation made it impossible to do the right thing. Hearing you scream, it felt like maybe this time I could do something that mattered." "And did you do something that mattered?" Marcus looked across the table at her, taking in the determined set of her shoulders. The way she met his eyes directly instead of looking away. The small scar on her chin that he'd just noticed for the first time. "I think so. But not just because I helped catch some criminals." "What do you mean?" "I mean that meeting you reminded me that there are still people in the world worth protecting, that there are still fights worth having, even if they're not in Afghanistan or Iraq." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. "So what kind of fights are worth having in Chicago?" Over the next several weeks, that question led to a series of conversations that changed both of their lives. Marcus discovered that his military skills translated surprisingly well to civilian security work, but not in the way he'd originally imagined. Instead of just installing alarm systems and checking locks, he found himself consulting with women's shelters, community centers, and schools about how to create safer environments for vulnerable people. Sarah took the trauma unit job and threw herself into the work with renewed passion, but she also began volunteering with a program that provided support for crime victims, using her own experience to help others navigate the aftermath of violence. Their relationship developed slowly, built on shared meals and long conversations rather than dramatic gestures or passionate declarations. They both carried scars from their past experiences, and they both understood that healing was a process rather than an event. Marcus started sleeping better. The nightmares gradually replaced by dreams about the future, rather than regrets about the past. Sarah stopped looking over her shoulder when she walked down the street, trusting her instincts and her training instead of being paralyzed by fear. 3 months after the courthouse hearing, Marcus asked Sarah to move in with him, not because they were swept away by romance, but because they'd become partners in a deeper sense, two people who brought out the best in each other's courage and compassion.
"Are you sure about this?" she asked as they packed up her apartment.
"I snore, I leave dishes in the sink, and I cry during movies. I have nightmares, I clean my weapons at the kitchen table, and I don't know how to cook anything except military MREs," he replied. "Sounds like we're perfect for each other." They weren't perfect, of course. Marcus still had days when the weight of his military experiences felt overwhelming, when he struggled with feelings of helplessness and anger. Sarah still had moments when the memory of that night in the street made her freeze up, when she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. But they'd learned to recognize those moments in each other and to respond with patience and understanding rather than advice or solutions. When Marcus woke up from a nightmare, Sarah would make him tea and sit with him until he was ready to talk or ready to go back to sleep. When Sarah felt overwhelmed by memories of the attack, Marcus would remind her of all the people she'd helped since then, all the lives she'd touched as a nurse and as an advocate for other victims. The martial arts studio where Marcus lived became a gathering place for other veterans who were struggling with the transition to civilian life. Sarah began bringing some of her patients there, particularly young men who had been victims of violence and needed to rebuild their confidence and sense of personal safety. What emerged was a community of people who understood that healing wasn't about forgetting trauma, but about transforming it into something useful. Veterans teaching self-defense to crime victims, nurses providing medical training to people who worked with at-risk populations, former victims becoming advocates for others going through similar experiences. Detective Coleman became a regular visitor, bringing cases where traditional police work wasn't enough, where the victims needed more support than the system could provide. The informal network of helpers that grew around Marcus and Sarah began handling situations that fell through the cracks of official institutions.
"You know what's funny?
Sarah said one evening as they sat on the roof of the building looking out over the city lights.
What's that? A year ago, I was just trying to get through each day without anything bad happening. Now I'm actively looking for ways to get involved in other people's problems. Regrets? None. What about you? Do you miss the military? Marcus thought about it for a long moment. I miss the clarity of it sometimes. In combat, you always knew who the enemy was and what you were fighting for. This is messier, more complicated. But it's also more personal. In Afghanistan, I was protecting abstract concepts like freedom and democracy. Here, I'm protecting people I actually know and care about. I can see the difference I'm making in ways that feel real. 6 months after they'd moved in together, Marcus and Sarah were approached by a local non-profit organization about formalizing their work. The organization offered to provide funding and legal support for a program that would combine victim advocacy, veteran services, and community safety education. What would we call it? Sarah asked as they reviewed the proposal. How about second chances? Marcus suggested. For people who need help starting over after trauma. I like that. But are we ready for something this big? Marcus looked around their apartment, which had become an unofficial headquarters for their informal network of helpers. Veterans sleeping on the couch while they looked for permanent housing. Crime victims meeting with Sarah for counseling sessions at the kitchen table. Community organizers planning safety workshops in the living room. I think we're already doing it, he said. We'd just be making it official. The program launched 6 months later with a staff of 12 people, including several veterans, 2 social workers, a nurse practitioner, and a former police detective. Their first office was in a converted warehouse space donated by a businessman who had been helped by their network after his daughter was assaulted. The grand opening was attended by dozens of people whose lives had been touched by Marcus and Sarah's work. Crime victims who had regained their confidence. Veterans who had found new purpose in civilian life. Family members who had learned to support loved ones dealing with trauma. Detective Coleman gave a speech about the importance of community partnerships in public safety. Sarah's brother Danny, now in his final year of college and planning to become a social worker himself, talked about how his sister's courage had inspired him to change his major. Marcus's former commanding officer, who had flown in from California for the event, presented them with a flag that had flown over their base in Afghanistan. But the moment that meant the most to both Marcus and Sarah came at the end of the evening, when a teenage girl approached them hesitantly. Are you the nurse who helps people who got hurt? She asked Sarah. I'm one of them. Yes. What's your name, honey? Jessica. My mum said you might be able to help me. Some guys at school have been bothering me, following me home, sending me creepy messages. The school says they can't do anything because it's not happening on school property, and the police say they can't do anything because they haven't actually touched me yet. Sarah and Marcus exchanged a look. It was exactly the kind of situation that had brought them together in the first place. Good people being threatened by those who preyed on the vulnerable, falling through the cracks of systems that weren't designed to handle complex problems. We can definitely help you, Sarah said, putting a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. That's exactly what we're here for. Marcus was already thinking about the practical steps. Talking to Jessica's parents, documenting the harassment, working with the school to change their policies, connecting the family with legal resources, teaching Jessica practical safety skills. But more than that, he was thinking about how far they'd all come from that Tuesday night when Sarah had screamed for help in a dark street. The fear and vulnerability that had brought them together had been transformed into strength and purpose. The trauma that could have defined them had instead become the foundation for helping others. See? Sarah said quietly to Marcus as they watched Jessica's mother arrive to pick her up. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the reason we can help other people through the worst things that happen to them. Marcus nodded, understanding completely. They'd learned that heroism wasn't about being fearless or invulnerable. It was about choosing to act with courage and compassion even when you were scared, even when you were hurt, even when you didn't know if you were strong enough. Plea who made the same choice, and together you became something more powerful than any of you could have been alone. 2 years after the Second Chances program officially launched, Sarah stood before a congressional subcommittee on veteran affairs, preparing to testify about innovative approaches to helping former military personnel transition to civilian life. The hearing room was packed with advocates, veterans, and family members, but she found herself thinking about a different audience. The night shift nurses, who were just starting their shifts at hospitals across the country, walking the same dark streets she used to walk. Thank you for having me here today, she began, her voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. 2.5 years ago, I was attacked on my way home from work by 3 men who had been stalking me for weeks. That attack could have been the end of my story. Another statistic about urban violence. Instead, it became the beginning of something I never could have imagined. In the audience, Marcus watched with pride as Sarah described their work with Second Chances. The program had grown beyond anything they'd originally envisioned. They now operated in 12 cities, with satellite programs in rural areas where resources were even more limited. Their model of pairing veterans with civilian professionals to address complex community problems had been adopted by organizations across the country. The key insight that emerged from our work, Sarah continued, is that trauma doesn't have to be the end of someone's story. With the right support and opportunities, it can become the beginning of a deeper commitment to service and community. After the hearing, Sarah and Marcus walked through downtown Washington, past monuments and memorials that honored previous generations' sacrifices. The city was bustling with tourists and government workers, people whose daily lives were protected by sacrifices they rarely thought about. "Remember when you used to say that your military skills weren't useful in civilian life?" Sarah asked as they stopped in front of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Marcus ran his finger along one of the names etched into the black granite. "I was wrong about that. I was thinking about it backwards." "What do you mean?" "I thought civilian life would be easier, safer, less challenging than military service, but the real world has just as many battles that need to be fought. They're different kinds of battles, but they're no less important." Sarah nodded, thinking about the cases that had crossed their desks in recent months. The veteran who had prevented a domestic violence situation from escalating by recognizing the warning signs from his own experience. The former victim of assault who had talked a suicidal teenager through a crisis because she understood what it felt like to have your world shattered. The community organizer who had used tactical planning skills learned in the military to coordinate disaster relief efforts. "Sometimes I think about those 3 men who attacked me," Sarah said. "I wonder what their lives might have been like if someone had intervened earlier, before they became predators."
You think about that a lot?
"More than I probably should. Morrison was only 22 when he went to prison. That's younger than Danny is now. Somewhere along the way, he made choices that led him to that parking lot. But I can't help wondering if different support systems, different opportunities, different role models might have led him somewhere else." It was a question that had shaped much of their work over the past 2 years. Second Chances had expanded beyond victim services and veteran support to include prevention programs in schools and community centers. They worked with at-risk youth, trying to provide the kind of mentorship and structure that might prevent them from making the choices that had led Morrison, Walsh, and Miller to prison. The program that had started with one veteran helping one crime victim had evolved into a comprehensive approach to community resilience. Veterans taught conflict resolution skills to high school students. Former victims led support groups for people dealing with trauma. Community members learned to recognize signs of domestic violence, substance abuse, and mental health crises before they escalated into criminal behavior. "Do you ever regret it?" Marcus asked as they continued walking. "Taking on all of this responsibility. Sometimes I think about how much simpler our lives would be if we'd just let the police handle everything and gone back to our normal routines." Sarah considered the question seriously. Their work was demanding and often emotionally draining. They dealt with the worst aspects of human behavior on a daily basis, and the victories were often small and hard-won. There were times when she felt overwhelmed by the scope of the problems they were trying to address. "No," she said finally, "I don't regret it. But I do worry sometimes that we're taking on more than we can handle." That worry had become more pressing in recent months, as requests for their help had multiplied faster than their resources. The success of the program had brought national attention, which brought both opportunities and pressures. Funding agencies wanted them to expand rapidly. Media outlets wanted dramatic success stories. Politicians wanted to use their work to support various policy agendas. But Marcus and Sarah had learned to be suspicious of quick fixes and simple solutions. The problems they addressed were deeply rooted in poverty, trauma, social isolation, and systemic failures that had developed over generations. Real change required patience, consistency, and a willingness to work on problems that might not be fully solved within their lifetimes. "I got a call yesterday from a group in Portland," Marcus told her. "They want to start a Second Chances program there, but they want us to train 50 volunteers in a weekend workshop and have them operational within a month."
What did you tell them?
I told them that's not how this works. You can't create trust and community relationships in a weekend workshop. You can't address complex trauma with simple techniques. If they want to do this work, they need to commit to doing it right. That conversation had become a recurring theme in their lives. As the program gained recognition, they were constantly being asked to water it down, speed it up, or modify it to fit someone else's agenda or timeline. The pressure to compromise their principles in service of rapid expansion was something neither of them had anticipated when they'd started this journey. "Maybe we need to think about this differently," Sarah suggested as they walked past the Capitol building. "Instead of trying to expand everywhere at once, maybe we focus on training other people to build their own programs from the ground up." "You mean like a franchise model?" "More like a mentorship model. Find people in other communities who have the same kind of passion and commitment we started with, then support them as they develop their own approaches to the same problems." It was an idea they'd been discussing for months, but the congressional hearing had crystallized Sarah's thinking about it. The most powerful moments in their work hadn't come from implementing programs or providing services. They'd come from connecting with individuals who shared their values and helping them find their own ways to make a difference. Over the following months, they began restructuring Second Chances around that philosophy. Instead of expanding their direct services to new cities, they created a network of independent programs that shared resources, training, and support. Each local program was designed around the specific needs and assets of its community, but all were connected by common principles of service, healing, and mutual aid. The model proved more sustainable and more effective than their original approach. Local programs had deeper community connections and better understanding of regional challenges. The network structure allowed for sharing of successful strategies without imposing one-size-fits-all solutions. Marcus found himself traveling frequently to consult with new programs, but the work energized rather than exhausted him. Each community had different assets and challenges, which required him to constantly adapt and learn. The tactical thinking skills he'd developed in the military were perfectly suited to analyzing complex situations and developing flexible strategies. Sarah took on the role of developing training materials and support systems for the network. Her background as a nurse, combined with her experience as a crime victim and advocate, gave her unique insights into the intersection of individual trauma and community healing. But their most important work continued to be local, in the Chicago neighborhoods where they'd first met. The warehouse space that housed their original program had expanded to include a community center, a veteran services office, a victim advocacy clinic, and a training facility for law enforcement and social service professionals. On a Tuesday evening in October, exactly 3 years after Sarah had been attacked on 42nd Street, she and Marcus walked that same route together. The neighborhood had changed significantly in the intervening years. Several of the abandoned buildings had been renovated into affordable housing. The convenience store that had been closed the night of the attack was now open 24 hours and served as an informal community gathering place. The martial arts studio where Marcus had lived was now part of a larger community center that offered after-school programs for local youth. "Do you think they would recognize this place?" Marcus asked, gesturing to the bustling street around them. "Morrison, Walsh, and Miller? I don't know. I hope they're getting the help they need in prison. I hope they'll have something positive to contribute when they get out, even after what they did to you." Sarah stopped walking and looked at the exact spot where she'd been attacked. A streetlight that hadn't been working that night now cast bright light on the sidewalk. A small community garden had been planted in the vacant lot where the men had first started following her. "Especially because of what they did to me," she said. "If I can't forgive them, how can I ask other people to forgive the ones who hurt them? If I can't believe that people can change, how can I do this work?" That philosophy had become central to everything they did with Second Chances. They worked with victims and perpetrators, with veterans who had been heroes, and veterans who had struggled with the transition home, with community members who wanted to help, and community members who needed help. The distinction between helper and helped, between victim and survivor, between broken and whole, proved to be less clear-cut than anyone had originally assumed. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed Sarah a text message he'd received that afternoon. "Remember Jessica, the girl who came to our grand opening about the harassment at school?" "Of course. How's she doing?" "She just got accepted to the state university with a full scholarship. She wants to study social work. Says she's going to start a Second Chances program on her campus." Sarah smiled, feeling the kind of satisfaction that came from seeing seeds planted years earlier finally bearing fruit. Jessica had been one of dozens of young people they'd worked with, but her transformation from victim to advocate embodied everything they'd hoped their work could accomplish. "That's how change really happens," Sarah said. "Not through big programs or government initiatives, but through individual people deciding to take responsibility for making their corner of the world a little bit better." As they continued their walk, they passed other reminders of the ripple effects their work had created. The veteran who now ran a job training program for other former service members, the police officer who had changed his approach to domestic violence calls after attending one of their workshops, the high school teacher who used conflict resolution techniques she'd learned from them to prevent fights before they started. Each of these connections represented someone who had been touched by their work and had chosen to carry it forward in their own way. The network effect was exponential. Each person they helped went on to help others, who helped still others, creating expanding circles of positive impact that extended far beyond anything Marcus and Sarah could have accomplished on their own. But perhaps the most significant change was in themselves. Marcus had found a way to channel his military training and his protective instincts.